Now, the next theme is you are not alone. And so one of the first sort of lessons from your 25 years is listening to your elders. So to go to expand on that, I guess, is there an example of a time when someone who was senior to you gave you a really specific or good piece of advice that you acted on or taken away?
Yeah, I mean, it's throughout my career, I've had great advice from my elders, so to speak. And I think that, one reason for listening to your elders is that there's a certain level of respect that you give in to people who, came before you or were trailblazers before you. And so you need to kind of honor that, number one. And they have a huge amount of life experience that you may not appreciate. So early on in my career, at the time where I was getting caught up in the whole dot-com boom and thinking that was the future, I had this manager who had been around for a long, long time, and he was much older and more seasoned than me. And he was saying, look, this is just a bubble. It's going to turn. And initially I was quite dismissive of him. Actually, it kind of goes back even further. I was at one bank where I was using him almost as like the old school guy who doesn't get it. Whereas I was in the team that thinking we're the future tech.
Yeah.
This is the future. As it happened, I moved back to that bank and ended up working with him. And so I suddenly saw his process, and that made me appreciate, the depth and the knowledge he had. And so at that point onwards, I realized actually you shouldn't sort of just dismiss older people just because they don't seem to use the latest tech. So that was an important learning there. And then other occasions, especially when it came to office politics, I would often turn to people who are older than me, who'd been around, not necessarily in my own firm, just in general, had life experience. And they would tell me about the politics and would then tell me, look, you're just being naive to think that you're going to get your way if you aren't navigating politics. So that's been another point where it's been very, very helpful.
No, that's good. And then to flip that on its head, one of your other lessons is to listen to your juniors. So is there a time that a junior asked you something incredibly eye-opening and it really made you think twice about your process, or suggested anything that really made you kind of question your original trail of thought?
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens a lot. I mean, one of the great things about when you're working with juniors, people just out of university and you're much more experienced, is that they aren't afraid to ask the most simple questions. And so, like recently, for example, somebody in my team asked a very basic question. How do you come up with your trade ideas? And, it took me a moment to kind of think, actually, what is my structure for doing that? I thought about this. It's almost instinctive for me. And I thought I had taught him that, and then I hadn't. And so it forces you then to think, okay, what is my exact framework for doing that? And so that sort of sparked on a whole series of questions. The other one I think that often comes up a lot is when somebody asks you a basic question about markets. So for example, somebody could ask you in your team, how is money created? And you go, it's just there. Or like, how many dollars are there in the world? And you just don't know. Or what is a cross-currency basis swap? Sometimes you're so used to just looking at things as an instrument, you don't really understand the mechanics of it all. So then it forces you to understand the mechanics and then the plumbing, and it opens up a whole series of different, avenues that you could look at. Now there have been instances where somebody talks about something and it in a way which you haven't thought of before. So it really helps you look at that problem differently. So an example of that would be, I once had this junior who was a historian by sort of background. So typically in banks tend to hire people with STEM background. I had a grad with a history background, and at some level I was a bit dismissive of history as a subject that's sort of useful for finance, but through engaging and interacting with him, it made me really open my eyes to the value of history. Number one, it just gives you a perspective that's much longer term and allows you to understand how you could be in a new paradigm now, because there's parallels in deeper historic periods. I think another thing I learned from historians are that they're very good at working with imperfect sources. So things that, aren't so data related, they can work very well, patching things together.
Yeah.
So that almost like fundamentally led me to reevaluate my whole process by incorporating history a lot more.
A well-placed history grad.
Yeah, yeah.
And then kind of continuing on the kind of you're not alone theme. So we know that in banking, all of our conversations are recorded, our emails are recorded, sort of there's a bit of a big brother approach to it. Have you ever had any tech mishaps where, you know, something ended up recorded on your phone or email? Or so, for example, for me, I once replied all to a client list that had everybody's emails addressed in it, which I had to very quickly unsend. So any mess ups like that?
Yeah. I mean, there's been lots of mess ups like that. Often email reply alls or replying when I'm sort of talking about somebody else, replying to that person, you know,
So
in a bad way, which has happened to me once, where I was trying to engage in a political thing, you know, to undermine somebody, and it blew up in my face when
That's karma.
sent it. That's karma, yeah, absolutely. But the broader point here is that it's this idea that you need to do things in a way where if the public found out what you were doing, would you be comfortable with that or not? And there's kind of a religious analogy to all of this, which is, you know, people who have a religious background or in older times would have this notion that God's always watching you. So in private, you don't commit sin either. In less religious times, which is the era we're in now, is more secular, and, you know, people are, you know, don't sort of believe in that as much. The irony is that of all the times historically, this is the time where everything is being recorded.
Yeah.
You know, so in old times when nobody really was monitoring you or tracking you, people thought there was a God watching you, recording everything, and so you shouldn't sin. Today, everything is being recorded. And then that sin, so to speak, can be revealed in a court of law.
Yeah.
It could be embarrassed in your social circle, you know, some message you sent.
Definitely.
And so that, you know, that makes you then become aware of your private and public actions. They should sort of, you know, be consistent with each other. The reference to religion is interesting because in religion, to deal with this private public situation, religion's very good at encouraging shame and guilt. You know, so you're in a private space, through guilt and shame, you don't commit those sins. And so that tells you that that's the way you can use those principles, so to speak, in our technology age where the God of technology is watching you. So when you do have that pang of guilt about doing something, you're sending that email and it's a bit mean or something, or undermining, or you're doing something that's a bit on the edge from a business perspective, you feel a bit guilty, use that feeling to think, actually, let me stop, pause, think about this, get someone else's opinion about this, and just not do it.
Yeah. That's pretty good advice. And then the other sort of lesson of you are not alone is just, you know, emphasis on family, on partnerships, etc. We know that kind of work-life balance can be a little bit difficult to strike, especially in finance at certain stages of your career. Do you have any rules that you stick with to kind of make time for friends outside of finance, partners, family, without kind of having work FOMO?
Yeah.
Or family FOMO for that matter.
Yeah. I mean, well, one thing I would say in general is that when you listen to lots of people on personal growth, productivity hacks, and so on, I think one thing a lot of these gurus miss out on is the importance of relationship. Especially male gurus tend to focus a lot on like individual optimization, diet, food, whatever, and all of those sorts of things, physical training. But for me, one of the most important things one can do is be in a long-term relationship, you know, whether that's long-term live-in relationship, marriage, whatever structure you want, but to live with somebody who's your partner. Now, in my own case, I'm married for a very long time. So that's the structure I'm in. And the importance of that is that you have somebody who knows everything about you. There's nowhere to hide, you know, with a person like that. And so they're almost like a mirror to yourself. You know, they're constantly mirroring, you know, lots of stuff. They're a point of friction as well. You know, they can see when you're going off the rails a bit, and they can kind of pull you from the abyss. And more fundamentally, there's a tension in your relationship. You know, you'll have conflicts in your relationship that you'll also have at work. And so you can kind of work it out as a couple, and then, you know, hopefully it will work out in the work context. But, you know, it by introducing this other relationship, you have something to balance your work relationship. Because if you don't have that relationship, it's so easy to get dragged solely into the work world. So having this other, you kind of have two relationships you're managing, your work relationship and your partner relationship. And that balance, I think, is an important counterbalance to that. So that's number one. I think that is understated. And I think people should not underestimate the importance of that. The second thing I would say in terms of separating work and life, work-life balance, it goes back to this earlier idea of you have to do things that are effective. You know, a lot of time is just wasted.
Yep.
So people spend hours a day just doing nothing, you know, just wasting their time, you know, writing silly reports or scrolling through the web or answering calls that won't lead to any real business, or, you know, things are just irrelevant that won't move the dial at all. So there's more than enough hours of the day to do a good job at work, you know, leave at reasonable hour and then have a healthy social life. And if you're not doing that, if your work is extending into your evenings, your weekends, that tells me that there's a certain suboptimal way you're working. You're inefficient in your work in some way. You're focusing on the wrong things. There's a weakness there somewhere. And on top of that, you know, important thing about having a life outside of work is that does help your work as well. It gives you better perspectives. It makes you more creative. It makes you healthier psychologically, and you end up, you know, working better, you know, at work as well. So there's this other sort of counterpoint to that as well.
No, it sounds great. Thanks for those lessons.